Thanks for showing up. My name is Johan Linåker. I'm a senior researcher at RISE, National Research Institutes of Sweden, assistant professor at Lund University, and my colleague.
I'm Sachiko Muto. I'm also a senior researcher at RISE, so a colleague of Johan's. I thought the room was so great, you know. We're in like this bubble, but there's some leakage, right? So we'll have to
maybe we can have a conversation between the rooms.
Bit. Yeah, exactly. That's not good for me actually, because I'll have a tendency to kind of think that there's a more interesting conversation going on over there. So I'll jump in, but I'll keep focused on you, Johan. I'm also the chair of Open Forum Europe. So yeah, but Johan.
So now you just have to make this extra interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we're going to talk about public sector open source. So this is both from a study that me, Sachiko, and colleagues, Björn, Francisco, Jonas, and Gregorio did in the public sector, looking at how mature public sector open source program projects, not OSPOs, are developed and structured. And then we're also going to tie into, because a lot of the challenges here covers or touches on procurement in different ways. So Sachiko is also going to talk about the upcoming revision of the Public Procurement Directive, tying into the work that we've done and how we can work towards making procurement better. So this study that we did was really very empirical. We wanted to know how our public sector working, collaborating, developing open source. So we looked at 5 cases that we identified by really mining 7 of these national software catalogs. We have the Italian one, we have the French one, we have the Finnish, the Swedish, we had the US and the Canadian ones as well, to really find some good characteristical and mature projects. One of them was the Energy Plus project from the US, highlighting how energy consumption is simulated, driven by the National Research Institutes, several research institutes under the US Department of Energy. We looked at OS2 Forms, a project from Denmark, collaboratively developed through a vendor together with a number of municipalities. We looked at Oscari, the geographical platform for the national land survey portal in Finland, operated by the National Land Survey of Finland. We looked at Geotrek, which is a platform for the French national parks, mainly developed by 1 or 2 national parks, but really in a collaboration with several. And then the Marche Simplifiée, correct my French, but it's a French e-service platform developed by Denum. And we have the IO app, which is basically a citizen-facing single point of entry application developed by Pagapa, a financial service, state-owned company under the Italian Ministry of Finance. So just jumping in, what we saw is that development kind of looks a lot like we see in other places. There's a core of people, typically below 10, 15, that does the development of at least 80%. They do more or less open development. Most of it is actively pushed to GitHub or GitLab. Some are less doing more of open releases, but still doing the issue management and everything. But it's very formally and agilely structured, much like my experience with industry. And one reason for this is that the development is typically centered within one or a very few number of organizations. So we're not seeing like this open collaborative development as we see in community-driven open source. It's much more resembles to what you can see in maybe single vendor open source projects, where you have rather a user community rather than the collaborative community. Then there can be different types of contributions. Our interviewees reported both the government institutions and the vendors that there was generally a high level of quality because the business criticality and so on due to these facts. What we could also nuance and tying into this and maybe making it a bit more elaborate is the types of sponsorships, or again how everything is brought together. So there's one sort of centralized sponsorship or centralized ownership where the development, I talked about single vendor, so basically where the development is done or funded by one or a few very resourceful organizations, like the National Land Survey in Finland. They are driving the development of the Oskari, the web portal project, although with input and funding from a smaller set of other entities. Also in the Energy Plus context, where you have a couple of research institutes driving the development, but it's mainly sponsored by the U.S. Energy, Department of Energy. Then you have the more decentralized sponsorships, where you have multiple, and then when I say multiple, it's at least beyond 7, 8, more about 15 up towards the hundreds of public entities collaborating, co-funding and pooling resources through various, typically public associations. We can see a lot of examples, like with OS2 and the OS2 Forms project, but we can also see in terms of the Geotrack project how several national parks come together and basically pool funding through one public entity, so not like a steward or an association, but really through one public entity. Either case, there's a high reliance on external resources. Typically, they have very few internal, fully hired government employees doing the development. In the decentralized cases, where you have multiple entities like municipalities, they go through a vendor or service supplier. When you're looking at more larger organizations like the National Land Survey, they rely a lot on the consultants, bringing in consultants, but having that also as a state of mind by rotating consultants into the projects. Their intention is to really ramp up and enable commercial support. So hopefully these consultants can take what they learn, bring back to their consultancies, and really help to promote the sustainability. And one exception here is the Pagopa, the public state-owned company in Italy, where there is really only state-owned employees working on this, and that's intentional because they want the capabilities. That's why Pagopa was created. It came out of the Develop Italia project, so they want to grow the capabilities to stay sovereign, to be vendor independent. So this is really a intentional step. So there is really a dependence here on external capabilities, because basically public sector, at least what we are looking at and what we know since before, is there's a high reliance on sourcing or outsourcing.
Maybe I can, oh.
No, go ahead.
I mean...
No, I mean, it's basically what I said before. It's the suppliers become a critical enabler for the sustainability of the open source projects and for the open source adoption in the public sector. So this is really recognizing the role of the service suppliers and the vendors.
I think just on the last point, because you're talking about sort of relying on external resources, I think these interviews that we did for this study really quite fascinating, actually. I had a very good time doing these interviews, because you realize that having this dependency on like external, often individuals who might be, you know, a few in numbers and sitting on almost unique knowledge, and you know, they're critical, which is similar to a lot of other open source projects, I guess, that, you know, it relies on a few people who are really sort of key to it. But when it's in the context of a public sector open source project, you also have to add in the complexities around public procurement around this, because what happened indeed was that there is these budget cycles and things like that, and you know the people that are interacting internally in the public sector with these consultants, they know that they are crucial for the project, but they cannot always because they are not employed full time. There is a kind of, they also think about what else they should be able to do in order to sustain living, etc. So I think this we noticed with some interviews that it can the fact that you know you're going to need this person, but they might have to take on other projects and other things in order to make a living. And, you know, because you might not have the budget approved or something like that, something might be on hold, or you might have to go and do, I mean, there were restrictions around public procurement that made this, I think, compared to all open source projects that rely on key figures and there's sustainability aspects of that, with public sector open source projects, you're also adding into the mix the complexities around public procurement. So I think that's an interesting one.
Definitely, and really thinking like long term. So you need to think about the sustainability of the project. So really ensure that it's staying maintained. So not just like you need to consider the sustainability of the vendor's business model, even though some maybe think that's the role of the vendor. But there's a mutual dependency here that needs to be considered. In terms of decision planning and governance and everything, we saw a very broad breadth of different models. I mean, everything from having more open technical steering committees with more or less full representation from the community, or at least the ones contributing to the funding, to maybe more like where you have direct connections with the vendor, creating some kind of risking to create multiple communication threads where not everything is transparently or open. There may be direct connections between some municipalities and the vendor that are disconnected from the larger community conversations. And some conversations in governments are typically only internal, especially in these cases where it's developed by one main organization. Like in the March Simplifier, the really intent is not really to have an open collaboration, especially also not in the IO app. So there the governance is much more internal in a way, even though there can still be like more smaller like issue requests coming from the ministries and so on. But otherwise it's much more one-on-one, and the governance is really managed internally. The risk here when you fully outsource the governance to the vendor, and really because there is this conversation: is public sector fit to run open source projects? Not in every case, maybe. It's not in their goals or in their strategies or letters of instructions. So a risk is that if you outsource it completely to the vendor, that you will end up in a soft lock-in if you're not on your toes. But also if you're not including them in the governance, they may need to have a higher pace because they are working with this more continuously on a day-to-day basis, while maybe municipalities meets on a like quarterly basis to discuss like the roadmap. So there needs to be a balance here. And one interesting nuance is that in all cases the vendors and the contractors was typically from the national or regional areas. So there was a high level of connection to the local ecosystem, which was interesting, especially in the context of the digital sovereignty. In terms of communication, it's, like I said, sometimes it's inside directly with the vendors, so split up, sometimes more open. And this is really, there needs to be a more coordinated communication here, because it risks creating these cliques, these islands of communication, of development happening, some being excluded and then development happening on the side, not like a joint communicated roadmap. We also saw that, again, we're talking about user communities now, typically not developer communities as we see typically in community open source. everyone here is users basically, and then they can contribute. Some just use, and some will contribute financially or with subject matter expertise, or in the requirements engineering process, quality assurance, and so on. So that's also an important difference to consider. And also, while the number of PSO of public sector organizations is maybe not that big, typically the number of end users, however, is so much higher, because these projects, they underpin publicly facing digital public services, with addressing like the IO app, for example, in Italy. I'm not from Italy, but from my understanding, it's used by a lot of people to manage their taxes and so on. And then we have this concept of sustainability, that you need funding for it to be sustained. It's the same thing as with community open source, when you have one individual developing in their spare time or trying to get enough consultancy hours to make a living. Same thing here with decentralized and decentralized sponsorship. When you're dependent on just one public body, if other organizations starts adopting it, if this, just as with single vendor open source, if this public entity pivots and drops the project, a lot of people will be standing there. Like the Oscara project with the National Land Survey of Finland, they found one model where they have several public entities using this software with their own web portals to donate a certain minor sum of 1,000 euros or something to help enable certain staff to promote the project. And then with the decentralized sponsorships, typically when I speak to municipal associations, it's really when you get around 30 to 40 municipalities using and adopting the projects, sharing the costs and the burdens. That's typically when you start reaching sustainability. When you have like 5 or 10 or something, it's bare minimum. It's very sensitive. So it's really about growing enough interest, enough public interest, and enough public sustained interest that can keep on funding and sustaining the project. So I mean, a lot of this really comes down to how we can encourage and promote collaboration and adoption of procurement practices, and really, get the public sector up and running. Do you want to take over?
This is when we make the switch?
This is the cue.
Oh. Okay, it's not just a matter of adjusting the microphone here. I can't even, okay, I have to choose. I'll stand on this side. So, by the way, Johan and I are colleagues and worked together now for 3 years. And I think the first presentation we gave together, I scared you because I spent 20 minutes on the first slide. We had a long, I mean, it was like an hour presentation, but it was still, it wasn't quite moving along, I think, in the way that Johan was hoping. So I think this is a better setup. Like you present what we said that we were going to present, and then if there's some time, I can come in and then we can talk about sort of opening up discussion. What are my takeaways, and I think in this context, it's really like, okay, what are we bringing to? Why are we talking to the Linux Foundation? Community and the summit here. I mean, I started coming to these events a few years ago now, and for the first couple of years there was a lot of focus on the CRA. I was on a lot of panels on the CRA, and we were trying to get everybody in the room sort of mobilized and engaged in that. I think here, Johan, we're talking about really, and this was kind of the segue slide I thought about, because we presented the cases that we looked at. I invite you to look at them, some of them again. The GeoTrek one actually won the European Commission OZOR award a couple of years ago. There was a competition by the European Commission basically to award the best open source project in the public sector. And GeoTrek, I think Démarche Simplifiée was a runner-up, but the GeoTrek was the winner. And I think it was just after COVID, and I was sitting. I had the pleasure actually of serving on the jury for that, and it was such a beautiful case for open source in the sense of pooling resources in an area where it's not your core competence. And this was, the national parks in France coming together and understanding that we have this amazing, public a thing of public value, and how do we make sure that we reach people so that they can get the most use out of this? And this is something, like Europe has many areas of outstanding beauty or whatever, but it's not the national parks. They're there to preserve it. And of course they have a public function to also bring people, but how do you bring people there? How do you have the best digital tools for this? It's not in anybody's interest that that each national park or even each country should spend, too much money on developing sort of the digital infrastructure, the digital tools to ensure that citizens can benefit from that. So that was a really beautiful example of like a public interest where we could pool resources and use an open source technology that can also be sort of adapted and implemented locally. So that was not even something I was meant to talk about, but I think it's important when we talk about open source and we talk about public policy that we are able to tell these stories also. Why open source is not just about should we choose this commercial open source for our desktop, or should we, renew our proprietary licenses to this other? I mean, it's more than that. And I think what we want to say, and I think again, not to take anything away from those great examples, actually, is that what we saw is that the public sector in general is not benefiting fully from the adoption of open source. Oftentimes we see it's using a regular or sort of an ordinary public procurement process specifying an open source license. Then you get, some company coming in and developing something for you with an open source license. It doesn't come with the community. It can also lead to a situation of lock-in. You have not really, and even though there is the potential for reuse, we have not seen much evidence of this actually happening. And so what I was going to talk about is how the green button. No, the green. Okay. I want to talk about a once in a decade opportunity for the open source community to get involved in public policy. And I think this is more important than, more important. We shouldn't, it's not about comparison, but the open source community got involved in CRA, seeing that as a kind of public sort of threat to the way that open source is developed. But if there's one conversation that keeps coming up since I started in open source in 2007, it's this notion of procurement. How do we get public sector use of open source? And we used to run into this wall of, not understanding how to acquire software, where it wasn't about, paying for a license, all these things. And I think, we have now in Brussels, the Commission has presented, I'm just trying to not use too much like Brussels lingo here. Paula, you're sitting there, thank you, laughing. Basically, we have seen an intention from the Commission. There's been a call for evidence. How is public procurement, the Public Procurement Directive working for Europe? Okay, this is not just IT procurement, this is procurement across the board. It's a €2 trillion market or something like this. But what the opportunity is here is, I think, to educate policymakers about open source and bringing that into this discussion. And I think these kinds of opportunities are not, do not come around very often. So here is an opportunity to engage in the process and making sure that we get in the drafting of the regulation, we get something that understands that procuring IT is not about just buying a license. Because the reason I said there's an opportunity is that, and I think this is what most people will have heard of this kind of buy European. Because traditionally, the directive on public procurement is like, it's a fundamental piece of legislation for Europe. This is basically establishing or trying to establish a European market. And in order to sort of alleviate the situation where you have a Spanish market or or a Finnish market or whatever, you want to like really enable the full European market and competition within that market. So traditionally, the rules have really been about sort of what's the most economically advantageous. This is the kind of argument you get when you talk about open source procurement. They'll say, and then you'll have the situation where they'll say, well, they'll compare commercial open source with a proprietary solution. And they'll say, yes, this is cheaper, but look at all the features. So that's the reason too. And now we are going to open up for this non-price criteria. And this is where, we'll be talking about energy efficiency. We'll be talking about digital sovereignty. This is where the buy European aspect can come in. But I think this is also a big opportunity to talk about open technologies and about co-creation of technology, about informing this concept of total cost of ownership, and what is a feature, what is a non-price criteria in terms of having control, about having flexibility, about all these things should come in. It's not about features only. All these other things are also important criteria, and to also think about it's not just the price off the shelf, it's about the cost long term. So really, I'm hoping that the open source community will get involved in this kind of educational effort because there's an opportunity right now.
Can I just add?
Yes, yes, please.
So, just one thing about. Whoops.
Yeah, because you're taking the microphone.
Yeah, of course. No, but I think this is a really important opportunity for the open source community, as with the CRA, to come in. And when we talk about digital sovereignty and interoperability or whatever, typically the value propositions for open source is more soft, so they're very hard to quantify. If you look at the numbers, open source will most probably be much more expensive. It's only in the long term, and when you've reached a really large number of reuses that you grown this user community, that you can really talk about the economic upside. But it's the other upsides that you need to consider and relate and compare. So when you're talking about total cost of ownership and on the plus side, how do you contrast and compare all of these things? And there are maybe not on like quantifying like the positives, but there are some good resources, like in Italy, for example. They have procurement guidelines since the 2020s in terms of how you evaluate the health and security and compare and contrast both proprietary and open source products. But still, so we did a study, me and Sachiko, for the Danish Agency of Digital Government, where we looked at 16 different countries, policy-wise and support mechanisms, and there was a lot of good examples, but those examples needs to be fed into this.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I can go back to that point, I think it's easy to say, oh, we'll make the, that the procurement decision is an easy one. We'll look at what we get and the cost. And I think that this is just not, it's not easy at all. What goes into both, actually? What is considered, a feature that you want and what should be counted as the cost. So I think that's really important, and it requires a different mindset around this for sure.
And a lot of skills and training. I know, Mike, we talked about the project about doing courses and trainings for mandatory for public procurement officers in terms of just what the F is open source, what's an open source license, how do you consider it in the public procurement process? Not just starting off the procurement, opening the catalog, looking at the typical vendors, but also considering point A, what open source options are there, what proprietary options are there. So there's the skills aspect, both around decision makers, procurement officers, IT officers, and so on.
Yeah, so back to my ulterior motive of sort of submitting these talks that get accepted at the conference, but really I want to talk about sort of how can we get the open source community to stay engaged. So we already talked about the CRA, I talked about the upcoming procurement directive. Another one which has already been sort of adopted is the Interoperable Europe Act, and it's about sort of how do we stay engaged in some of these things. Often what happens is that, you know, there's a kind of political process, and there's a sort of, there's a, there is heightened, saliency, people get involved, they want to like fix the wording in some legislation, etc. But especially in this case, there is an intention from the European Commission here to do things. It's not just a regulation that sets out what member states should be doing or what businesses should be doing. This Interoperable Europe Act is something that sets out an intention from the European Commission, let's say. And I know that they are thinking right now, how do we make the most out of this that we have now? Some kind of mandate, which already puts an obligation to the member states to when they are sort of, it already contains this obligation for when the public sector authority in Europe develops what is called an interoperability solution. And of course, what is an interoperable solution? But it's basically sort of something that relates to a trans-European digital public service. And this could actually be almost anything. It could be narrowly interpreted, or it could be quite broadly interpreted, because, within the European Union, citizens have freedom of movement. So in a way, anything that relates to the citizen could relate to their ability to move to a different country. And so where they are in need of being able to maybe show, their birth certificate or something from relating to schooling or health, even though those things are potentially, possibly outside of the sort of EU mandate, if it pertains to e-government services to the citizen and their right to move in the EU, I think this could be quite broadly interpreted. But what is required to make this broad interpretation is that we need to have voices pointing to this existing piece of legislation, pointing to an obligation from the member states to share and reuse, to develop solutions that are shareable and reusable. And how do we, so basically we have an existing piece of legislation. How do we stay engaged to ensure that now that public sector bodies are grappling with sort of their obligation, that this doesn't just become a box ticking, like, it wasn't an interoperable, it didn't have a trans-European, it wasn't a trans-European interoperability solution, it's just something we're doing for our citizens here. No, it could potentially be broader. And so, and then within the Interoperable Europe Act and the actions foreseen there is also about developing shared, European e-government services. And so there's also an opportunity, I think, to kind of highlight not just insisting that they should be based on open source, but as an open source community, understanding what is the full potential of open source, including the innovative and community aspects, that we bring this kind of information to the to the public sector. So in a way, both insisting on kind of the obligation, but also coming with our wealth of knowledge, let's say, and offering the help. So I think that was our last slide, Johan, and
5 minutes left.
yeah, would you?
You managed.
Do you want to? I don't know if you wanted to wrap up. We have another presentation also. Right, you can also mention that. If you want more.
Bring it.
Yeah.
Any questions?
Yeah.
I get the impression you are asking us to manage managers, people who don't know what they're talking about, who want to be safe and not take no risks. And that's not, I'm not trained to manage managers.
So I think you're kind of almost opening up for a bigger issue, because the revision of the public procurement directive, again, isn't just for like technologies, for everything. And I think to some extent there is this view that the public sector in Europe, or I only know about Europe, we have officials that are basically there just managing procurement contracts. And so there is a need for, if you're not engaged in the activities, but you're only, and I look at somebody I spoke to earlier today about the Professor Matsukato at UCL is actually doing some interesting work on public procurement, basically talking about the fact that if the public sector is not at some level involved through co-creation, then it can no longer, stay relevant for its citizens, because it has to have a basic understanding of what is happening outside of the public sector. And so, yes, what you're saying is that it's not your job to tell them how to do their job, is that what you're saying? I think we could see it as a sort of, to put a slightly more positive spin on it, because the European administration, they are depending on stakeholders to come, and they have an obligation to listen to stakeholders, but I think also stakeholders have an obligation to inform the public sector on how to make good legislation, for example. So I'm talking about the legislator now, but also the public sector, how it should be implemented. So I think it's not your job. I don't know what your job is, but I think as citizens or business owners or whatever, I think if we have information that is valuable to how we should run or have a better society, I think that we should bring that. Yeah.
And just a comment, I mean, we looked at 16 different countries in the previous report, and for example, in New Zealand, they co-created the open source policy through crowdsourced initiatives, while in some there are like top-down legislative in policies initiatives, and sometimes it's bottoms up from certain like front-running public institutions, some municipalities. So it's really you need all of this mix, and you need stakeholders both from civil society. In the Czech Republic, the civil society has been a very important voice, also in Romania and in many other countries as well. You need representation from all stakeholders driving this change, because otherwise nothing will happen.
Claire.
Thanks. I just might it be possible to find someone who can start a co-creation collaboration like this? I mean, my challenge. I come from Ireland, small country, don't invest a lot in, or as far as I know, any investment that has gone into public sector open source co-created, particularly across national boundaries. Getting them from what is open source to facilitating something like that is such a huge leap. But having a project, which you can say, wouldn't it be great if Ireland collaborates in this? Here's a pathway for how you procure. Here's a document how you procure. It's there. Just put some money in and we can start getting started. Would be a much easier pathway to get them on board rather than education, convincing, getting them to start something. So if this European interoperable Europe thing exists, if there are existing projects that are really useful, couldn't we get one of them to put forward a proposal for multi-country co-creation for the next version or something? So we could all promote that as being something we could all get on board on, or a couple of options.
The two best examples, of course, of this is, there's X-Road, and there is the collaboration between the German-French collaboration now, which is, I think, interesting. Actually, there are other people presenting on that, of course, here this week, but I think it's more about sort of an interesting idea where like one country has leadership of one project and the other, I think, of the other, and then it's a bit like, okay, let's continue the collaboration or continue developing these together. Maybe that's wrong, actually, but I think the X-Road is interesting because that was, started by the Estonian government, right? And then the Finnish government came on board. And now, I'm not going to give a whole thing about X-Road, but the thing I found very interesting about X-Road is not only that it has been adopted in many countries beyond the sponsoring countries, but I heard I think it was an Estonian minister who basically said that they now have more Colombian contributors to X-Road than Estonian. And I think that's a huge achievement, because it means it's gone beyond sort of one, single sponsor project to actually, not just a wide implementation and use, but that actual, contribution from beyond the original sponsor. So.
We're on time, but just a final comment is that a lot of the most successful cross-border collaborations we've seen, they've really transitioned to creating some kind of stewardship body or an open source foundation-ish, and then that enabling more countries to join. But there's a lot of barriers like generalization, localization of the solution. Some are very specific to the Italian legislation, for example, or a hard-coded Italian language and whatever. There's a lot of these things that puts a lot of limits, and also like how you do governance and how you can do procurement and contributions. These processes and ways of working aren't always set up. There are many other barriers as well, but those are some. I think we need to end.
Yep.
Thank you.